overlooking the pond, Lucas began to map out his moves. His sled was his pride and joy, and he didn't want to damage it in this stunt. He always cared well for the sled, and today, before they left home, he had waxed the runners with bear grease so it would run fast and with less friction. He was as proud of it as any of his possessions. In truth, however, he had never actually tried to jump anything with it. From his view high up, the pond suddenly looked a lot wider than he had pictured it in his mind. Nevertheless, even at 10 years of age, Lucas didn't have an ounce of quit in him, and he would never admit that he was afraid of anything, especially not in front of his twin brother and his friends. The boy sat down on the sled and grabbed hold of the thick rope that steered its front end. He inched forward until the front half of the sled was hanging over the edge of the top of the hill. He took a deep breath, pulled his feet in tight, leaned forward, and ducked down as far as he could. The sled practically flew down the hill, and as he had calculated, when it hit the bottom where the hill sloped upward, the sled took flight. The crowd of children on the near bank of the pond threw their hands up and cheered as Lucas sailed out across the ice toward the far shore. For a few moments it looked as though he might actually make it, but as could be expected, gravity eventually took control, and the sled plummeted downward at a very sharp angle. Lucas gripped the rope tightly and leaned forward as much as he could, hoping he might gain a few extra feet, but it was useless. He crashed into the pond right where the ice was so thin it could not hold the weight of both sled and boy. The next thing Lucas knew, he was plunging deep into the freezing water. Fortunately, he had managed to take as large a breath as he could seconds before breaking through the ice. The sled pulled him downward, but as soon as he was able, Lucas pushed back with his legs as hard as he could, propelling himself up toward the surface. He hoped to swim straight up and shoot right out of the hole he had crashed through, but the sled had entered at a steep angle. When Lucas finally reached the underside of the ice, he found it a solid sheet. The hole was nowhere to be found. Cold and disoriented, the boy began to feel his way along the underside of the ice, trying to locate the life-saving opening. For his age, Lucas was a strong swimmer, able to hold his breath a good length of time, but the cold, combined with his fear, sapped him of his energy, and he soon began to panic. Unable to cry out while underwater, he began praying, repeating over and over in his head, help me, please don't let me die." Holding his breath for as long as he could, he began to struggle, and just before he began to give up, he heard or perhaps felt a large splash in the water. Suddenly, an arm reached out and grabbed the waist of his jacket and began pulling him over and then up through the elusive hole in the ice. Once his head popped through the surface, Lucas inhaled the fresh air deep into his lungs, but that only made him cough uncontrollably. He began shivering uncontrollably as he realized that he had almost drowned, that he had been saved. "Okay, boys, now, pull with all you got," Jamie yelled. He had a thick rope tied around Lucas's waist now, and he was holding onto his waist tightly with his arm. The rope was stretched across the pond's edge where the group of kids had stationed themselves, watching and waiting and worrying. They began pulling together with all their might. "Pull harder!" Jamie shouted, just as the two slowly came up and out of the hole and began to slide along the top of the ice. When Lucas began to shiver so hard that Jamie could hear his teeth chattering, he assured his brother that he would be fine. "Not too fast!" a skinny red-headed kid shouted. "We don't want the ice around them to crack and suck them back in. It's hard enough pulling as it is, without having to drag them through the water." One of the other lads, a tow-headed boy named Jeff, dropped his grip on the rope and motioned for another one of the boys to follow him. "We need to get a fire started. As wet as they are and as cold as it is, the two of them will freeze to death." Children in the North Woods learn survival skills at a very early age. Up there, you either learn how to deal with nature or you end up dying. Everyone, regardless of age, carried a fire starter or a pack of strike-on-anything matches. As frightened as these boys were, it didn't take them long to gather kindling wood and get a good-sized fire going. Once the brothers were finally back on dry land, the rest of the boys helped them over to the fire and out of their wet clothes. While they were drying off, several of their friends gave up their coats for added warmth and protection against the cold. "Good thing I listened to Pa's advice," Jamie commented, shivering right down to his bones. "How's that?" Lucas asked in what could only be described as a faint whisper.